There is a place in America where the sun does not set for 84 straight days in summer and does not rise for 67 days in winter. A place where a single state contains more coastline than the rest of the country combined. A place so massive that if you split it in half, both halves would still be the two largest states in the nation. That place is Alaska. And here is what most Americans never stop to think about. If the rest of the United States disappeared tomorrow, if every supply chain collapsed, every federal dollar dried up, every shipping route shut down, Alaska might be the one state that could actually make it on its own. Not because it is the most developed, not because it has the biggest population, but because Alaska sits on top of a combination of natural resources so absurdly vast that most countries on Earth would go to war just to control a fraction of what this single state already has. And the story of how that happened starts with the land itself. Alaska covers 663,000 square miles. To put that in perspective, it is more than twice the size of Texas. You could fit California, Texas, and Montana inside Alaska and still have room left over. But size alone is not what makes it special. What makes Alaska different from every other state is what is underneath it, what swims in its waters, and what flows through its pipelines. Start with oil. Alaska sits on top of some of the largest petroleum reserves in North America. The Prudhoe Bay oil field on the North Slope is the single largest oil field ever discovered in the United States. When production peaked in the late 1980s, Prudhoe Bay alone was producing nearly 2 million barrels of crude oil per day. That is not a state economy. That is a national energy supply coming from one frozen stretch of tundra. And here is what most people do not realize. Oil revenue is so central to Alaska's identity that the state has no income tax and no state sales tax. Instead, every resident receives an annual check from the Alaska Permanent Fund, a savings account built entirely from oil royalties. In some years, that check has exceeded $2,000 per person. That can mean a family of 5 getting paid just for living there. No other state in America does anything like it. And oil is just the beginning. Alaska has massive deposits of natural gas, with estimated reserves of over 200 trillion cubic feet. Most of it remains untapped on the North Slope because there has never been a pipeline built to move it south. It has zinc, lead, gold, silver, copper, and coal. The Red Dog Mine in northwest Alaska is the largest zinc mine in the entire world. The state produces more zinc than most countries. If Alaska were its own nation, it would rank among the top mineral producers on the planet. Now add the ocean. Alaska's coastline stretches over 33,000 miles. The fishing industry pulls in billions of dollars worth of seafood every single year. The harvest includes wild Alaskan salmon, pollock, crab, halibut, and cod. The port of Dutch Harbor in the Aleutian Islands consistently ranks as the #1 fishing port in the United States by volume. In some years, more fish pass through Dutch Harbor than through every port on the entire East Coast combined. Think about that for a second. One state, enough oil to power itself, enough minerals to trade globally, enough seafood to feed millions, and we have not even talked about freshwater yet. Alaska holds roughly 40% of all the surface freshwater in the United States. Let that sink in. 40% in one state. While states like Arizona, Nevada, and California fight legal battles over every drop from the Colorado River, while entire cities in the Southwest ration their water supply, Alaska has more fresh water than it could ever use in 1,000 years. Glaciers, rivers, and lakes so enormous that some of them do not even have names on any map. In a world that is running out of clean water faster than most people realize, that is not just a resource. That is a strategic weapon. So if Alaska has all of this, why does it still depend so heavily on the rest of the country? And this is where the story gets complicated. The answer comes down to one brutal word: geography. Alaska is the most isolated state in the Union by a staggering margin. It does not share a border with any other state. To drive from Anchorage to the nearest American city of any real size, Seattle, you would have to travel over 2,300 miles, most of it through Canada on a 2-lane highway that closes in winter. There is no railroad connecting Alaska to the lower 48. There is no direct interstate. Almost everything that Alaskans consume, from groceries to building materials to medicine, arrives by either cargo ship or airplane. And that makes everything expensive. A gallon of milk in rural Alaska can cost over $10. A simple home repair that would run a few $100s in Ohio might cost thousands in Fairbanks because the parts have to be flown in on a small aircraft. If you are enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe because we break down stories like this every week. The cost of living in remote Alaskan communities is among the highest in the entire country, sometimes double or triple the national average. This is the paradox that has defined Alaska since the day the United States bought it from Russia in 1867 for $7.2 million. It was a deal mocked at the time as pure foolishness. Newspapers called it Seward's folly, after Secretary of State William Seward, who negotiated the purchase. Critics said America had just bought a giant block of ice that would never be worth anything to anyone. Those critics could not have been more wrong. Within 3 decades, gold was discovered in the Klondike, and hundreds of thousands of people stampeded north. Within a century, oil was discovered on the North Slope, and Alaska became one of the most resource-rich territories on the planet. The land has everything, but getting that everything to market, or getting anything from market back to the people, is a logistical nightmare that no amount of resources can fully solve. And yet, Alaskans figured something out a long time ago that the rest of the country is only now beginning to understand. When you cannot depend on a supply chain, you learn to depend on yourself. Alaska has a culture of self-reliance that is not a bumper sticker. It is a survival strategy. Families hunt moose, caribou, and elk, not as a hobby, but as a primary food source. Subsistence fishing is not a weekend activity. It is how entire communities make it through the winter. In rural villages, people still heat their homes with wood they cut themselves, store meat in underground ice cellars, and travel by snow machine across frozen rivers because there are no roads. If you have ever wondered what actual American independence looks like, not the political slogan, but the daily practice of feeding yourself, warming yourself, and keeping your family alive without a grocery store or a gas station within 100 miles, Alaska is the closest thing to it. And honestly, if that does not impress you, nothing will. But here is where it gets really interesting, and most people have no idea about this part. Alaska is not just surviving on old traditions. It is also building infrastructure that could make it genuinely self-sustaining, in ways that would have seemed impossible 50 years ago. The Trans-Alaska Pipeline, completed in 1977, stretches 800 miles from Prudhoe Bay to the port of Valdez. It was one of the largest private construction projects in American history, built across 3 mountain ranges, over 800 rivers and streams, and through permafrost that engineers said could never support it. It proved that Alaska could move its own resources at an industrial scale. More recently, the state has been expanding renewable energy in remote communities. Wind turbines power villages along the Bering Sea coast. Hydroelectric projects bring power in southeast Alaska. There are even experimental tidal energy systems. These are small projects by national standards, but for communities that used to rely entirely on diesel fuel flown in by bushplane, they represent something much bigger: energy independence at the local level. And then there is the military dimension. which most people completely overlook, but which changes the entire conversation. Alaska is one of the most strategically important pieces of land on Earth. It sits closer to Russia than any other part of the United States, with only 55 miles separating the two countries at the narrowest point of the Bering Strait. On a clear day, you can literally see Russian territory from Alaskan soil. It provides early warning radar coverage for incoming threats from the Arctic and the Pacific. Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson and Eielson Air Force Base are home to some of the most advanced fighter jets in the American arsenal. Fort Wainwright houses Army units trained specifically for Arctic warfare. If Alaska were its own country, it would have a military presence that most small nations could only dream of, sitting on a piece of geography that controls access to the entire Arctic, a region that is becoming more strategically important with every passing year as the ice melts and new shipping lanes open up. So could Alaska actually survive on its own? The honest answer is yes, but with serious pain, especially in the short term. The cities would struggle. Anchorage, which holds roughly 40% of the state's total population, depends on imported goods in ways that would take years to replace with local alternatives. The healthcare system, already stretched dangerously thin across remote communities, would face enormous challenges without federal funding, and the specialists that funding attracts. And the sheer cost of building and maintaining infrastructure across a state that size, in that climate, with that terrain, would push any government to its absolute limit. But the raw materials are all there. The energy is there. The food is in the water and running across the land. The strategic position is unmatched. And the people, all 730,000 of them, come from a tradition that treats self-reliance not as an ideal, but as a daily requirement. Most states in America exist because of what humans built on top of them. Cities, highways, industries, universities, institutions. Take all of those away, and you have empty land with nothing to offer. Alaska is the opposite. The land itself is the wealth. The rivers are full, the ground is rich. The ocean never stops producing. And the mountains do not care whether the federal government sends a check or not, because they were there long before the first flag was planted, and they will be there long after the last one comes down. Still frozen, still enormous, still holding more beneath the surface than anyone has fully counted, quietly reminding anyone paying attention that some places were never meant to depend on anything other than what was already there.